All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to another webinar in our 2021 webinar series on international models and emergency management in collaboration with the International Emergency Management Society and Capacity Building International. My name is Kyle King. I'm the Managing Director of Capacity Building International, and welcome again to our webinar series. And today we are actually doing a second part in our three-part series with the University of Manchester. And this is something that I've really been looking forward to. And in our second part of our three-part series, we examine what is meaningful recovery from COVID. A panel of subject matter experts, so those are joining us here today, from TIEMS, the International Emergency Management Society, the UK Emergency Planning Society, and the Resilient Cities Network will provide insights from around the globe as we examine three key questions. And our host here, Duncan Shaw from the University of Manchester, will help us and facilitate that discussion today. But first, before we get into that, I want to make just take a couple of just minutes just to go over a couple of administrative issues really quick. And just because we all have been in webinars before, we're all very familiar with these items, but I'll just cover them very quickly. So again, joined here also by Harold Drager, from the President of the International Emergency Management Society. Harold, good to see you again.
Yeah, good to be here. I look forward for these presentations today.
And as previously mentioned, Duncan is here with us as well. And what we are going to discuss today, and just to give a brief overview of the series that we've had so far. So 18 out of 24 events. We've had about 1,390 attendees so far, and representing 66 nations during our webinar series. But really for today, one important point is the Q&As and the chat function. So as we're going through the panel discussion today, please use that Q&A feature. You'll see that in the toolbar in Zoom, which you probably already know where that is. And so we want to use that Q&A feature because it allows us to actually print the reports and have those reports of the questions that we can then give to Duncan later on for part of his research and the good work that they're doing over at University of Manchester. And of course, where are you joining us from? Let us know in the Q&A where you're joining us from, and let us know how wide-ranging the audience is today. So, future webinars coming up. As I mentioned, this is the second of a three-part series. The next one coming up on the 15th of October, I believe. And that's going to be on a discussion on the future of emergency management. After that, if you're following the TIEMS series, we're going to be going into smart cities and smart cities disaster response with the EPIDIS project and with the EU, and data science COVID response, and in technology and EM. Now, at this point, I'll turn it over to Duncan. Duncan, over to you, who will be helping us facilitate the panel discussion today. I'll be working behind the scenes and trying to capture your questions in the chat feature. I'll be monitoring the chat. So definitely, if you have any, kind of issues or technical issues or anything else like that, just put them in the chat and I'll be there trying to help you out with that. Duncan, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kyle. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon, this morning, this evening. Some of you may remember my colleague David Powell, who facilitated the last session that we had in this series, or the first in this series. So it's my pleasure to participate in this second, looking at managing a meaningful recovery. It's a topic that is very close to our hearts at the university. We've been working in recovery coordinating groups in the UK and overseas since almost the first few months of COVID began. We've been looking towards what does recovery mean and trying to understand what the process of recovery might look like. As part of that journey, we've been, as I say, working with local government extensively across the UK. We've been working with Ramallah, we've been working with Chile and Vancouver and various other countries, trying to understand what meaningful recovery looks like. And so today we're going to be hearing from four fantastic speakers about what recovery means in their parts of the world, and thinking about what does the language of recovery, what does that involve, and what sort of terminology might we want to use, thinking about the politics of recovery, thinking about the relationships, the partnerships that have been set up during recovery and that might need to continue to be set up. We've been thinking, and today we'll be talking about the process of recovery, thinking about understanding the impacts, understanding needs, lessons learned, and all about that process of designing recovery plans, designing renewal strategies, knowing where to start with recovery and where to stop, because recovery has been such a significant activity over the last few months. and then really starting to think of what does this word meaningful mean. So we're talking about meaningful recovery, but what does the meaningful mean? What does managing meaningful recovery mean in that word management? So these are some of the issues that we're going to be covering today from our speakers. Each of the speakers is going to have an opportunity for sharing 5 to 10 minutes of just general thought around some of those issues. We'll go allow them to do their speech, and then we will start delving into some of the questions that have been shared in advance. So those questions, first looking at how effective were our national and local systems for managing recovery to COVID-19? Second question around how effective was strategic advice on recovery in supporting those recovery groups and thinking through the process of recovery. And then the last question around standout lessons from managing recovery. Not all of our speakers are involved in the management of recovery, and that's absolutely fine because we want different perspectives, different voices coming into this. But all of our speakers are very well versed in the context around disasters, recovery planning, and so forth. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Stephanie. Stephanie is coming to us and bringing the voice of the Resilient Cities Network to this meeting today. Stephanie works as a resilience coordinator in Mexico City. She is the secretariat for the integrative risk management and civil protection committees within Mexico City. She's led disaster risk reduction projects across the world. She's been a teacher, a coordinator of international cooperation strategies, an attaché to the UN, worked for federal government, hugely active in the participation of young professional women in disaster management, and she's a graduate of Georgetown and of University of Chile. So I'm going to invite Stephanie to talk about some of the work that she has done, and then invite Nathan to talk about some of the work that he's been doing, then Lucy, and then Jean-Paul. And so, Stephanie, may I hand the floor over to you, please?
Sure. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Carl. And Carol, thank you everyone for joining us to this panel. As you were mentioning, it's important to know what can be done with different sectors and different cities and different decision makers' perspective. From our side, I'll be sharing with you what has been our main arguments in order to update our resilience strategy based on the response and the initial recovery from COVID-19 actions of the city. With this, I have to start by saying, yes, from the perspective of the Secretariat of Mexico City for Integrative Risk Management and Civil Protection, it is quite important to notice that first, for sanitary perspective, the general law mandates that the health sector has the responsible actions for taking and leading the extraordinary actions for leading the sanitary emergencies. And the rest of the cabinet must follow the orientation, needs, and priorities. With this into account, our secretariat does a follow-up mainly for natural hazards in this perspective, and another one that recently an unfortunate happened within the subway of Mexico City. This is some specific anthropic hazards. And by now, I'll start with this general perspective on who led the main response. First, it was indeed the Health Secretariat, but for this management of the COVID-19 response, I have to recall, that the city also had a somehow recent experience since the 2010 influenza pandemic of AH1N1 Mexico was one of the first countries to call the WHO in order to know what was happening, and this led us to know that it was important to know that we have to nurture mechanisms, preparedness plans for pandemics, but also for now, coming from even 11 years after, what was done, right? So for now, this perspective was not only to display the importance of having scientific basis or having or attending what the normative says, but also the main challenge was to test our management systems for the response, but also seeing it as a comprehensive one. And afterwards, the initial recovery actions. In order to know who did what in our city, it is important to say that the health sector oriented the whole government, and the head of the whole government. This health sector is led here by the Dr. Oliva, And then the head of government, Dr. Claudia Sheinbaum, had a leading role and also held important and constant press conference to communicate what was going in the discussions with the local, metropolitan, and federal governments. So she communicated this whole general perspective and background of the pandemic, the management, and had a strong support of the Digital Agency of Public Innovation. This is one of the main aggregated facts and values of this strategy, because it was not only talking about policies and the whole technical perspective or even bureaucratic sometimes, but it was also about telling the people what, how, and when to go in order, in a very easy way, to understand how to respond and what they can do within their networks. Other topics that were mentioned through the conferences and during the initial strategy were, of course, how to manage the response and access to public services, and also the important public partnership facilities to provide access to health services, or where even there weren't enough. There were also participation of other secretariats for mobility, tourism, citizen security, depending on what their aportation or contribution from their sectors provided. But something quite important as well is that there was a strong and quick response from the legal counsel office in order to see how our government could continue their operations and which were the conditions under the whole sectors could still carry their own activities. So once I have mentioned like the whole how to know who did what in general, these were the main principles that guided the response for Mexico City strategy. And these were not only for the response, these are still ongoing for some recovery activities. But in this, I would say that the leading role of the head of government also enabled the draft, not only these principles, but also being adapted, because most of these principles are still, or were being drafted, at the reconstruction strategy that started after the 2017 earthquake that hit the city. And most of these were part of what had to be done, or what was the vision that citizens that were affected by an impact, and I will say affected, not necessarily agents of change or with a more proactive capacity, what would be happening after from the role from the government, and what would be done in order to communicate where and how each of the sectors should participate. And this, with these principles, it's just a matter for you to note is that this helps us to identify first the needs, which were the sectorial decision making that had to be done in which type of priorities, who should communicate with whom. Another aspect is that this enabled as well to urge the reactivation of justice services, and at some point did get interrupted. It wasn't a 24/7 service, and it's common for emergencies, but these were also bases that enhance and urge how to reactivate some of these public services. Another strategic consideration was that there was an important effort in order to decrease any restraints from accessing to health services. That we have a different type and many types of health services in the city, but for the response, there was an homologous participation from different sectors, and in some point, even for attending or accessing to a second level of attention, people could go to some private hospitals to get the attention in where the public service was at the top of their capacities for attending COVID cases. Here I'd like to show you, this is important, what I have told you about the principles, not only because we're still ongoing with a reconstruction strategy ongoing, but also because within a context that we are living, and most of the different cities that we see even through the country did not activate these mechanisms and communication services, or even access to information. And there's also a strong austerity plan happening in Mexico City, and so this like looking on the macro level, it no longer seems obvious or as a minimum effort, and it's something that keeps challenging us. And here is why and this is important because this refers us to the part of, okay, so who decides what is important? In this during this whole response and initial recovery that we have been having in the city, these are the 8 decision-making groups mechanisms that have been created, and we identify from these attach topics from the local economy, the economic level, metropolitan governance. Each responds to a specific goals, and we know each is important. But I kept wondering if this is something that was challenging us at the resilience office, is what would happen with a strong earthquake, no? Which we had a couple of weeks ago. So would we be having a new mechanism, or we had a special research for the event of the subway, as I mentioned at the beginning. But as the list could increase according to the hazard, something that we were wondering is what would we be doing in order for all of these mechanisms to stay relevant? What can we do to be held this accountable and with public attention? How can we better prepare the city for a macro structure, and to not be afraid of recovery, or just giving it like agenda without no specific response or result? So something else that we did and wanted to share is that we identified which type of programs were offered. Some of them were existing, some of them were just specific for attending epidemiological services, and some others were new. And this is important because we know that according to the hazard and impact, the needs will be different. And we will be happy to share this with you because the list is really impressive. But it was more about this exercise is that we try to identify which could be the roles and functions that different sectoral structure institutions could participate depending on the hazard. Most of these activities could be repeated in different response strategies. So we could also, this is where we see an important opportunity to engage and to further develop capacities of prevention, preparedness, and with other institutions that did not have disaster risk reduction or disaster response institutionalized, not even with their civil protection plan. So this is one of the main reflection that we have after seeing which were the services and programs that were being offered. From the Secretariat's contribution, we did a technical assessment based on updating protocols, providing as a companionship and constant dialogue with different partners from the private sector, from public institutions. And what we did were going to public services, accessing and giving counseling to families in the hospitals. There was a technical effort for providing a socioeconomic impact assessment at a high level working group with a specific secretariats, and this was an effort and evaluation made among with the Economic Commission for Latin America from the ECLAC. Something we also did was the support in the command center in order to provide attention for people with suspicious of COVID, assistance in sanitary filters and social preparedness. But most of it was based in increasing the risk communication awareness in different sectors and to better prepare and adapt our instruments and protocols. This was apart from the fact that we were considering and are still working on the update of our resilience strategy based on recognizing that each sector has an important role in order to prepare, not only having the same institutions or the same groups deciding the same, because as we've seen in this part of the services and programs, there are different initiatives and facilities that need to be considered for the response. Just to finalize, our opportunities for having a resilient city that considers a meaningful recovery is that, yes, we did have an intergovernmental coordination. We did increase our cross-sectoral partnerships. The existing programs help to speed the provision of economic transfers and health support. But also, this was another important opportunity to take digitalization to another level, access to for the population and for us as the public institutions. And another opportunity was to update our main document, the resilience strategy, because it needn't consider this type of hazards, needn't seismic risk, or even social development components. So this was a main opportunity that we're taking, these ones that are in the green, at the green square, and something that we are working on, and some opportunities that we have to enhance is to continue contributing to the planning instruments in order to have a multi-hazard approach, not only consider all this is for risk, this are for floods or different or other phenomena, mainstreaming DRR in order to see that we have seen that different sectors have an important contribution, but we didn't have this technical and permanent work with them. For example, the fine and social protection. And this was not a main opportunity also to consider what I was mentioning you before with the decision-making mechanisms. How can we do this institutional structure for recovery planning and long-term recovery policies? What do we consider, or should each mechanism will provide their own goals? So what can we do? What can we do and strengthen in order to not try to omit that the goodwill will happen eventually to whomever has leading the response strategies in the future. And finally, just to finalize that each sector has an important role in the disaster management cycle for us. These are the main considerations that we wanted to share from Mexico City perspective. And these are my contact details. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I hope I didn't pass too much time. But yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful. There's so many lessons there, but I realize that we're going to have opportunity to bring this together in discussion group. But agents of change and having very clear principles, thinking, you've talked a lot about governance, which I think is something that we'll really pick up on. But that agents of change phrases keep going around in my head. So I think that's something that we'll certainly pick up on as well. Thank you very much, Stephanie. May I hand over to Kyle?
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, and thanks, Stephanie. Very insightful presentation. And what we'll do now, so I just wanted to take a couple of seconds here to introduce Nathan Rogers, who's joining us now, and give us a few minutes just to share his thoughts on what he's seeing from his perspective. And so Nathan is a seasoned professional with 18 years of experience in the emergency management field and over 15 years with the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency. During that time, Nathan served as a United States permanent representative to NATO's Civil Emergency Planning Committee, representing the U.S. on policy matters regarding civil preparedness and crisis management. Nathan currently is the CEO of the Canmore Company and supports U.S. government efforts in building resilience in partner nations. Nathan, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Kyle. Appreciate that introduction, and greetings to everyone, Kyle and Harold and Duncan. Thanks so much for the organization here and bringing me into this discussion, my fellow panelists. Looking forward to the dialogue here today. And thanks for, frankly, taking on this topic. I think this is one that will be with us for some time. Just hearing the word recovery at this point in COVID, I always sort of tilt my head towards that connection, as I don't think we're quite there yet. Of course, it's important to view it from a continuous improvement standpoint, which this is, I think, a contributing element to that. These discussions very much contribute to this rolling evaluation as we stay on top of our ability to continuously improve our response. So thanks for organizing this discussion. Kyle, you mentioned, I got a career in emergency management, and certainly that's where my mind often goes when we think about the COVID response here. But my last experience in government service anyway, working with the international community on this topic, just further reiterates the importance of connectedness, the interdependency that we share across borders, not just jurisdictions at local levels, not just regions in one country, but of course among the international community. And so some of my remarks are with that in mind, as well as the kind of national and sort of more local or regional emergency management. But really delighted to be a part of this. I think there's a few things that, just for Wavetop's opening here, that come to mind as we consider the questions before us for this session, and again, that we'll be revisiting in the future. But when we talk about effectiveness of recovery programs and recovery efforts, that certainly varies by the lens, right? Effectiveness varies greatly by the lens in which it's being looked through. And I think when we think about if it's by casualty counts, death rates, the things we see in the headlines most often, I think there's a tendency to have rather negative connotations towards the effectiveness of COVID response and recovery. But then you could also look at effectiveness of bringing the community together, the effectiveness of citizen resilience to some extent, the effectiveness of public-private partnerships, which I'm sure will be a theme here as we get into it. The effectiveness of our ability, tens of millions of people, to basically upend and dramatically shift their day-to-day lives and put things on hold. And for a restless nation like the United States and others, a very restless nation, that takes that's a big change, and takes a lot for citizens used to a certain way of life to be disrupted in a certain way. And so I think there's arguments on both sides here. We're looking forward to the discussion here on effectiveness here of the recovery, and again, what lens we're actually looking through in engaging that or evaluating that level of effectiveness. I think you also have to look at some of the good news in the sense of there's been certainly an increasing emphasis on emergency management in recent years. We're seeing more EM programs than we ever have in history. Of course, they're emerging at organizational levels. This is far from becoming a government-only initiative. Of course, we're seeing emergency management programs throughout industry and academic institutions, international institutions now embracing emergency management collaborative forums. So it's very encouraging to see those developments. Also encouraging to see the dynamic with the public health community. As a career emergency manager, there traditionally was this dynamic and interesting special relationship, I'll call it, between the emergency management community and the public health community when it comes to crisis management. And it was something that we long sought after to really foster a close relationship there, given the critical interdependency of incident management priorities. And here we have one at the tremendous scale that we're now operating with, this global pandemic. I think that it drives those two communities further and further together. But this also recognizes that the pandemic, this scenario really offers challenges that no other scenario offers. There's no tape around this scenario. I can't put certain caution tape around it and control one scene, for example, or even just in one jurisdiction, one country. And it requires that much broader engagement than emergency management in the public health communities. And I think that's one of the big lessons coming out of this is really looking at emergency management as a discipline and factoring in, what is its responsibility here when it comes to not just managing COVID, but the resilience from such a widely scoped crisis. Nothing reaches the ends, the depths, the general breadth of our economy, frankly, than a pandemic and this global health crisis. And so further drives the need for emergency management to demonstrate its role as that lead convening authority for many jurisdictions anyway, in pulling in the various capabilities required for that full systems response, because this does in fact require an all hands on deck. Yes, emphasis in the public health sector. Yes, our health systems are tested dramatically here, but this requires industry often to step in and provide private sector solutions. This requires those non-traditional actors to really play a bigger role here in their community, first and foremost, in supporting their neighbors and those that they impact most day to day. We talk about resilience often, and we really learn through this process. Those that are essential for our day-to-day lives and our day-to-day economy, and making that run. It's public health, public safety, but it's grocery store workers, delivery drivers, it's janitors, it's the social workers. These folks. I think there's a renewed spotlight on these. I would say also local heroes that are really helping sustain to the way possible our way of life to the best extent possible. So hats off certainly to those groups. So again, effectiveness. This is a question of effectiveness. Really depends on the lens. I think we're looking through it. I think in many cases it's been highly effective in driving cooperation, driving the need to maintain focus on emergency preparedness. This amplifies and completely, or certainly helps justify investment in mitigation, investment in preparedness planning at all levels. We must maintain a focus on these topics at the highest levels. We must have the legislative backing to free up the resources to enable nations to respond accordingly. So if there's an expression in the business, many of on the line here are familiar with this, but never let a good disaster go to waste here. This is one of a proportion will have widespread lessons throughout our society that I'm hopeful emergency management communities in particular can, again, use their convening authority and that capacity to fuse these lessons together. And so that we are continuously improving our plans and process and capability. And also, and this was alluded to earlier, restoring some faith in our institutions. I think it's one thing we talk. I think another question we'll get into here is the provision of strategic advice, right? And that's really, there's a people part to that, but there's an institution part to that. And I think both have been under extreme strain here. And so part of this process, as we think about evaluating the effectiveness of COVID recovery here is restoring faith in institutions and reiterating the importance of continuity in these institutions. And revisiting some of those traditional, values, principles, and capacities that we've relied on for so long, and those institutions that execute those capacities and capabilities on a regular basis. So, I'm looking forward very much to that discussion here as we get further into the details. But I think we balance this people versus the institutional piece quite often here, and as we've seen in the U.S. and elsewhere. There's an interesting dynamic to be mindful of also in our discussion today, and that is this relationship between leadership and politicization. And in many countries, right, we have leaders who are politicians, and we've seen how dangerous, frankly, I would say, it can be when a crisis is politicized, and how it costs. There's certainly some arguments for how that can cost. Ultimately lives, but it shapes the resource management. It shapes the overall national posturing. It shapes the messaging. It bears weight on the credibility of institutions that we've relied on so long for being the central authority on the matter and providing that advice to the citizenry. And so when you look at a population like the U.S. And its scope and scale, we have such a layered response to crisis management, which again typically works very well, and we rely on it heavily, but it also enables that many more sets of leaders and that many more sets of decision makers and more sets of political processes and to really weigh in to the decisions that are affecting the lives of obviously their jurisdictions, their communities, but can have ripple effects well beyond their borders. So I think my message here, there is an absolute critical role more than ever for the emergency management community to step in as that convening authority to rally this whole of society, well beyond government, this whole of society connectedness on this topic, as well as reaching out and building the capacity, moving us forward towards a greater state of resiliency, locally, regionally, nationally, and certainly internationally. I think in the NATO forums and the EU forums, OSCE forums, we talk about resilience being a national responsibility. Violently agree with that. However, I would argue that there is an international, collective imperative that we work together on this topic. And if we should absolutely be using COVID as a galvanizing force, frankly, to convene forums like this and elsewhere, share these practices and come out of this much stronger than we went into it, because this will happen again. We must be of the mindset that these hazards and threats we face, increasing in complexity, they're increasing in severity. This will come back around. And so we must take these hard lessons on board and take an honest view at ourselves as an international response community, and really go forward as smartly as we can for a greater state of resilience in the future. So anyway, Kyle, thanks. I just some opening scene setting here. Looking forward to the discussion with my fellow panelists here on how we go about doing that, and some other assessment, perhaps findings I can share as we move along here. But effectiveness varies greatly by the lens. Leadership matters. The relationship between leadership and politicization is a critical one that we must be mindful of. And then again, resilience, national responsibility, collective imperative. These are some of the main themes I think I'll be hitting on here as we go forward in our discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Nathan. Much appreciated. And Duncan, I see you're back, so I'll hand it over to you.
I am. Thank you again, Nathan, for that. That was a really great tour around many of the big issues. Just in your summing up, some of the other things that you talked about that really struck a chord with issues that we're facing in the UK is that notion of a restless nation. People have a certain way of life; they want to get back to that certain way of life, and what does that mean for recovery? So we've very much a lot of the recovery groups have been talking about business as usual. Let's get back to business as usual. Let's stop talking about the pandemic. And we can understand the reason for that. But whether now is the right time for that, or whether maybe that's something that needs to be thought about a little bit later, is open for discussion. Something else you mentioned with that whole society aspect, and something that is really important in the UK at the moment. And we've been talking also about hyperlocal, is local, but then hyperlocal. So getting down to street level, community level, and really thinking about that. So many things you touched upon, Nathan. So thank you very much for that talk. And we'll pick up on many of those in the discussion, as you said. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Lucy Easthope. Lucy is bringing the voice of the Emergency Planning Society to the meeting today. She has been working in recovery during disaster. For over 2 decades, she's been challenging people to think differently about the aftermath of such tragic events that we've seen in the UK and overseas. She's been very active at national, local, community levels within the UK and overseas. And I'm going to be listening with interest as I heard Lucy talk about some of the very passionate experiences. Maybe that's not the right wording. She's talked very passionately about some of the experiences that she had in working with her local community during the early days of COVID in a recent talk that she gave in the UK. She's very active in the Emergency Planning Society, and she's a fellow of that society. She's an author, a professor in practice at University of Durham, co-founder of the After Disaster Network, researcher at Massey University and at University of Bath. Lucy, I'd like to hand over and give you the opportunity to share some of your thoughts, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me today. It's an absolute privilege. I've sort of focused in a little bit, just briefly, because I know I want to get to the discussion session very much on the personal, the toll, the personal labour of responding, I think, in recovery, and also, what it feels like as emergency planners in the UK to see this event. Those of you who work in the UK, but also many other countries, have a similar structure. We have a national risk register, and a pandemic, albeit in terms of some of the way it was described, an influenza pandemic was considered our highest risk. And we also planned for other types of pandemic very, very religiously, including a corona pandemic. And one of the things that we would do, even though the delegates in the room would fight us on this, we would plan for recovery. So one of the first things I think that the Emergency Planning Society in the UK had to do, and I saw commentators do it in many other countries too, particularly from my experience in the US, was bust a myth that this pandemic had come over the horizon completely unprepared and unexpected. And we had been dipping our toes into the last few years of really pointing out to the nation and to journalists and to others that emergency planning was a thing, and that we used emergency planning to prepare communities. And so, for example, with me, I'd done a couple of quite resonating, explosive articles in sort of 2017, 2018 about, hey, when those spontaneous centres are built after flooding, they're not a surprise, that they're built by emergency planners. So one of the things that was very interesting, journalists were very interested in very quickly, was the idea of there is emergency plans. And then what they came back and said is, yes, but you plan for response. You can't possibly plan for recovery. And of course, that had been a huge part of UK emergency planning. And we'd formalised it. It's part of our non-statutory guidance that accompanies our legislation. And we'd issued guidance in 2007. But recovery is inherently political, with both a big P and a small p. And the idea of updating that guidance and various other pieces of work around it had certainly started to fade by the time of the pandemic. But one thing I would say, I think, that's perhaps quite challenging is by the time the pandemic came, there were just enough of us who had been really, really trumpeting and selling recovery management that it didn't get missed off at a local response level. And I get teased quite a lot because when I do media, I talk about there being local plans a lot and sort of using it as a kind of get out of jail card. Hey, this bit got screwed up, but there were always local plans. But I do really want to salute that, because that was, if I look back over my archive, we were doing workshops. The Manchester work was already, we knew of great universities already doing stuff. We were already, it was the thing. So by the time of the pandemic, that was a very important protective factor for us. There's always a protective factor, and then there's always a challenge. And I think one of the challenges with local planning was that the resilience for a structure, let's see what we conclude over the next couple of years, was quite difficult to embed, as Duncan was using the language there, the sort of hyper local, the difficult quiet voice, to hear sort of non-conventional ideas in. And we had struggled with a number of earlier incidents in the UK. We have major incidents all the time, as everywhere does. So what we were seeing was the Local Resilience Forum was struggling with the long-termism of recovery, and would also try and stay in a tactical response form. And so one of the things in the last year that slightly troubled me is that the same people who were at the strategic response just sort of took off one hat, put on another, and became recovery coordinators. And that isn't what I believe recovery to be. You've got to make much more space for community voices, and most importantly, something that was enshrined beautifully in the New Zealand recovery guidance, which really I think has become a Bible to recovery planners like myself. I'll put it in the chat, but the New Zealand Companion Through the Chaos is enshrining and protecting the role of the wild card in recovery. Now, it's funny enough, I've just come from another meeting this afternoon, and one of the conversations in that was about the toll that it takes on recovery advisors to advise on recovery. Because you are probably listened to, if it's a ratio, maybe 1 in 50 answers. The other 49 may be deemed not politically correct, not optically correct, not how we're planning to take the public in this particular way. They may not be resource possible. They may have legal implications. So it's very hard sometimes as a recovery advisor. One of the things I was very pleased with by the time of the pandemic was I was wearing quite a thick coat of scars from recovery advice, because I got very used to things either landing in soil and growing, or landing in soil and just being kicked away because of the political situation. So on a very personal level, in terms of my personal self-care and my family resilience, I was not perhaps as bruised as I was with earlier disasters when politically some things didn't land. The other thing that I've thought a lot about, and it's actually why I joined social media during the pandemic for the first time, was delivering recovery messages is very similar to being, say, a clinician, because people will say to you, when does this feel better? When does this feel better? When does this feel better? And you're saying, this is it now. There will be really good days ahead, but this is a disaster. Give it the gravitas it deserves. It has changed me and you. And so one of the difficulties is people, and particularly in local resilience forums, clinging to the idea of a magic wand that would bring back business as usual, whatever that was. And I had already articulated that quite extensively in my work, The Recovery Myth, where I'd really made clear that recovery is something that will take much longer than anybody expects, be much more painful. And the afterwards is good again, very much like people like Rebecca Solnit write about. The afterwards is good again, but you have to acknowledge the hireth, which I write about in my new book, which is the feeling of a life from before that is now just an echo. So all of us here will never now live a life that doesn't have at least 2 or 3 years in the middle of it, or at the end of it, or at early stages career, or wherever, that is punctuated by this disaster. And at the start of this, that was unsayable in national meetings. That was enough for the call to go quiet. And then, thank you, Lucy, that's all we need from you today. And then a follow-up that, that really wasn't the message. This wasn't a disaster. You're overthinking this. You've gone too big. You're using your disaster recovery tools. That's for other disasters, not for this. And that I was so glad that I've walked that path many times before as a recovery advisor, because that's quite a brutal process. So going forward, I think we're in a very exciting place. I use that very deliberately with, the points that Nathan has already made, that the pandemic provides a number of opportunities. These are all very difficult words to use around disaster, but opportunities to look at where we're at. The UK is just starting to get to the stage where it's articulating its impact assessment. Now, of course, that feels far too late for a recovery planner, but I understand why it's taken so long. Is because at earlier stages, those messages couldn't be heard, and we had this sort of malevolent buffer. So people would still be able to pick up a meal deal at the supermarket, and they would not give this the gravitas it deserves. We have a death toll worthy of a disaster, with a lot of a complicated bereavement and ambiguous loss. It has caused severe damage to our National Health Service, and probably one of the biggest recovery challenges we are now dealing with is the mental health toll on our youth and our children, some of which has come from some of the psychological interventions that we used in the early stages of response that those of us in recovery begged should not be used, because we were horizon scanning, which is what recovery planners do. So we're in an incredibly dangerous time. And the most important thing, I think, for recovery planners is what I call the Gandalf ambivalence from The Lord of the Rings, where Frodo says to Gandalf, I wish none of this had happened. I wish the ring had not come to me. And Gandalf says, so do all that see these times. And but what is important now is what we have, what we do with them, what we do with these times. And that's a really important point when we're looking at meaningful recovery, because we have to take stock of now. We didn't want to see this as pandemic planners, which is what emergency planners are. We have seen it. So what is on our shoulders now is what we do with what we've seen.
Great, thank you, Lucy. That's very insightful. And I think it's, the discussion around zero risk is really interesting in terms of, as we talked about getting back to normal. What is risk? What is zero risk? Can you ever get to zero risk? No, of course you cannot. So what is the level we're going to accept so that we allow people to move forward? And it's a really interesting discussion that hopefully we can get more into. But right now we'll go over to Jean-Paul. So Jean-Paul is joining us. Just to give a quick introduction to Jean-Paul, just 1 second. So anyway, Jean-Paul has been working in civil protection for a number of years, and has also worked as an EU expert in terms of civil protection and preparedness, and is also on the board of the International Emergency Management Society. So Jean-Paul, thanks again for joining us. And now we'll just turn the floor to you for a couple of minutes to give us some initial thoughts on recovering from COVID-19.
Thank you, Kyle, inviting me to this brilliant session. There were so many things that the previous speakers told that I'm overwhelmed by all these informations, to be honest. So I will try to give you some lessons learned, because in France we were not very good at the beginning, and I want to give a first remark to Lucy. Many years ago, I was in the National Fire Academy teaching emergency planning, and we met some searcher in human science, let's say. And after presenting a half a day, respectively, our works, and during the meal, because in France there is a meal, the people, the searchers told me, so you are planning, but if I well understand, the planning is more to reassure you rather than to help you when the incident occurs. So that was a case, that was a very interesting remark, emphasizing that we are planning, but when the disaster strikes, it's always not fully prepared. So that was, of course, largely the case last year when pandemic strikes. And as France is a very centralized country by historical reasons, there was national management and national planning also. But the first month, let's say January, the first 3 months in France were very bad because at first there was some lying persons in Paris, especially about the masks, because there was a penury of masks, and they were minimizing the use of the masks and the efficiency of the masks. And the first lesson is when you have to manage an unusual crisis, first lesson is not to lie. Because if you are an industrial managing an industrial hazard or the same or a natural one by firemen, you don't lie about the truth. And also what is difficult is, especially in this crisis, to express the uncertainty. Uncertainty is everywhere, every time. And the first question is, how effective was the national system? It was very ineffective during the first months until the first lockdown in March. We can say it was a chaotic crisis management. And one of the reasons, following my analysis, one of the reasons of this chaotic starting up was that the government was at first reluctant to take the command fully at interagency level. The first months were only health ministry crisis management, and they took too much time to take the command. And another,
Kyle, I think this is not me on this occasion. This might be Jean-Paul.
Okay, so why don't we just go ahead and move on, Duncan, so that we can start with the questions, because I think Jean-Paul was going in that direction anyway.
So thank you to all three speakers, of course to Jean-Paul as well once he returns. But there have been so many things that we've covered across those three talks. Obviously, many of you have already addressed the questions, and I wonder if I can start to drill down on some of the specific issues that you've been talking about, one of which was politics. And I think Lucy really talked about some of the politics that she's experienced through some of those difficult conversations, raising difficult points, and then being asked maybe not to raise those difficult points. I just wondered, Stephanie, in the context of Mexico, some of the work that you've been doing in those, have you experienced similar things? How have the politics been within Mexico City?
Well, quite exciting. I mean, just as trying to use Lucy's rephrasal, right, in order to. So yeah, I mean, I refer to exciting because it gets quite anxious moment. Last year, I joined the secretariat, but also last year there was a strong discussion about deputy chamber as part of a federal order to eliminate the federal funds for attending disasters. So this was quite a limitative moment because there weren't any counterbalances, and at the moment there weren't enough processes that enable or look to dialogue with civil society and with other institutions. Now, I mean, the discussion happened. There were, and I was part of more civil society groups back then, and it was a very challenging moment. But now, a couple 2 months ago, there were the new terms of reference for these type of funds that may be seen. But as you may say, these are insufficient. We are not having it's never sufficient to have the emergency funds. But in these terms, it's also part of who have been drafting. getting to know the politics, it's important to see who's the person behind this drafting of terms of reference, what's the point of, or who are we targeting with the provision of transfers, and what are we really trying to solve or to decrease in terms of vulnerability and exposure of the population. And this is something that is still unfortunate for the city and for the country, because no further lessons and experiences from previous disasters were seriously taken with these new terms. So this is something that is our main challenge, and it will happen and have implications in the long term, because changing a law or even having these new funds is quite challenging. And as I mentioned, the austerity plans are very important and strong. So without this investment, without us, not even in the secretariat, we have funds for normal programs. So it becomes challenging. It becomes something that some other cities and some other actors share. But it's something that we have to mention and put on the table, that it's a pending debt to the citizenship for the city.
Great points, thank you. And something that I'm thinking Nathan might have a view on in terms of that funding of resilience, that funding of recovery. In FEMA in the United States, how does the funding of recovery work, Nathan? Are you able to shed a little bit of light on that for us, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Duncan, for the questions. And it certainly plays a big part, right, in getting communities back on their feet, if you will. But fortunately, FEMA has gone through a tremendous revamp, I would say, of how they offer and provide such assistance to make it much more easily accessible, much more rapid, I would say, in delivery. I mean, we're hat off now. FEMA no longer wearing the hat, but FEMA is now able to much more rapidly deploy not just capabilities and resources and things, which is certainly critical, but on the financial support end, much more quickly able to deploy financial help even during disaster. We saw this during the sort of the triple threat, the hurricanes. We recently, the Harvey, Irma, Maria combination, where streets are still flooded, and FEMA is cutting checks short right around that time. It was pretty helpful, and a lot of that goes to the capability up front to better assess the damage, right? Better obtain information from local leaders and incident management teams. So there's a relationship here between our ability to respond, our capabilities that we're improving, and our decision making, with providing the assistance in a most tailored and useful and effective way. I mean, this is, end of the day, these are disaster funds. This is these are taxpayer funds. So we must be mindful of how, as much as we want to push and get it to where it's needed as quickly as we can. We must do so as smartly and as efficiently as possible. And so I think FEMA's done a lot in the way of their public assistance process, public assistance funding. Survivor assistance, their focus on survivor assistance has been, I think, tremendously improved in recent years. But we've had to live some hard lessons to get there. The evolution of emergency management in this country, there's a good story there. There's some, again, hard lessons in that story. From its origins through. Usually it's disasters, not surprisingly, that shape national reforms and legislation for change, including the federal government, national government's ability to provide certain levels of financial and other assistance. So we've seen in the U.S. this pendulum. We're FEMA largely focused natural hazards before 9/11, and focused on those response recovery missions. 9/11 really swung the pendulum towards the counterterrorism and man-made threat, and shifted FEMA's authorities with it. And then Katrina happened, right? This is 2006 legislation kicked in, really brought the pendulum back towards the middle of this all-hazard approach. And now we're dealing with the greatest pandemic here in a century, and all the effects we're still reeling from. It really goes to show the scope, scale, breadth of a capacity that a national emergency management system needs to have, including, as you mentioned, during recovery, what funds are being provided to get communities back on their feet? How are we supporting businesses frankly, there is no recovery without the private sector. That's just flat out. There's no economy without industry. We've got to be mindful of that as government, that there is no recovery without the private sector. So how are we supporting small businesses, given the lion's share of that private sector is small business, where something like this, just one flood, many of these are on one disaster. It could be a small disaster in the grand scheme of things, but to that business, it's everything. They've lost the storefront, they've lost their footprint. So we've got to be mindful of the industry involvement here as we also provide that survivor assistance, provide the business assistance, and getting communities back online. But generally, I think, and FEMA's not alone, by the way. Other federal agencies providing assistance to this. FEMA certainly leads, I think, a lot of these efforts when it comes to directly providing survivors and with the financial tools available to get them back on their feet, or at least provide them some sense of stability for those initial weeks, probably the hardest weeks of their lives following such a tragedy. So anyway, mindful of those developments. Always interested to learn, I'd say, from other nations how they're supporting their local communities and regions. But I think FEMA's model has matured significantly. We're in, I would say, a much better place in that capacity than we have been in even recent years, but certainly over the past a decade or so in that regard. So great, it's a great topic, warrants its own full discussion, I'd say. But from what I've seen and been a part of, ample improvements here in that model of providing assistance and the effectiveness of that assistance to those that need it most.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm going to ask the same question to Jean-Paul and then to Lucy. Jean-Paul, we've heard Nathan really talk about getting communities back on the feet, the role of the private sector, the role of, and Lucy talked a lot about the role of local government in that context. What's been going on in France with regards to getting communities back on their feet, providing support through businesses? Has that been something that's been at the forefront of recovery efforts?
Yes, they were a big economic effort from the state, of course, to help not so much communities, because even if we are a very centralized country, there are also some concentrated bodies, administrative bodies, region and department in charge of supporting the communities. But for the economic and the companies, there was a big kind of new deal in giving public money to sustain the economy in France. And it was a big surprise, because in 2020 the number of mortgage was smaller than the previous years, and everybody said it will occur in 21, but now we are restarting without mortgage. So it's a real economic issue, a big question for all searchers in economy about, of course, the debt of the countries, the public money, the quoi qu'il en coûte. That was the words of Macron. Quoi qu'il en coûte means however it costs. And now, even if the government said we stop giving money to everybody because it restarts with very good numbers in growth ratios in France, it's quite surprising for them who are in charge of the crisis and resilience. But what I wanted to speak a little bit more is about the crisis, because if you want to be more resilient, you have to manage proper your crisis. And about strategic advice, because it was the second question of Kyle about strategic advice. Just one thing, it was a scientific body, a committee by the first minister, the prime minister, and the president. And for 1 year, it was quite only scientific advice, building crises day after day by observing not the future difficulty to plan, but the time. And on January, that was a really new step in the crisis management. The president didn't follow the scientific advice, saying, no, I don't do the lockdown. I wait. And we avoid the third lockdown. And the third lockdown was very painful for the economy. And that was a very good choice. And afterwards, there was also very good management with the sanitary pass and the obliging the person, including some reluctant population, to be vaccinated. In France, we have 67 million, and we have 49 million person with at least one jab of vaccine. It's also something unhoped for us. It's really a crisis. We don't know the future, and with epidemic and epidemiologists, even if there is some model, it's impossible to predict the future. With a variant, it's impossible. That's my first idea. And if I want to conclude about some big lessons learned, it's first is that we have to identify where is the bottleneck of a crisis. It was very simple in all countries. It was the hospital, unable to accept all these victims. For us, it was not a crisis. We could all day transport all the person, even if there were many persons severely injured, severely ill. The second is an economic lesson, because some economists began to give some part of the saved things by the injection of money in economy. And also there was a talk of an economist, famous economist in France, telling that vaccination was for some decade the best valuable public policy, because it cost 3 billions and it saves 300 billions. Because last year we lost 300 billions, and this year we didn't have this loss. And also, what is important to notice, it's the number of the death, because if you there will be many publications about the deaths. Around in France, 120,000. But what does it mean? If you vaccine, you avoid these deaths. And by the general economist, a life has a cost, a death has a cost. So if you vaccine, you save money as well. So that's very interesting. It's really a gold mine, this crisis, for those who want to study. That's my opinion.
Absolutely. There are so many lessons that I think we're going to take away from this crisis, and the lessons learned process. And I'm sure, Lucy, you're starting to think about what those lessons have been and the lessons learned process that are going on within local government. I think you mentioned also the impact assessments that are happening at the national level as well. John Paul talked about the need to start reflecting on these lessons. I just wonder, Lucy, if you have any insights as to what those lessons might be for the UK, and what you're hearing from some of those impact assessments, some of those lessons learned processes that are ongoing.
Yes, it's a very interesting one, because obviously there's a big call in the UK, and I'm sure it's mirrored elsewhere, for one of our rather clunky vehicles for trying to extract lessons, which would be a very large public inquiry. I think for those of us who've had concerns about the capacity of our National Health Service for a while, something around a commission that looks again at things like our operational ability to respond is probably essential. One of the wonderful things about working in emergency planning is, it's very easy to say that no lessons are learned, but one of the wonderful things in emergency planning is we do innovate constantly. So we have constant events where we say, what worked here? Can we change that? What didn't work here? We're incredibly agile as a profession. And one of the interesting things is reflecting, for me personally, the difference between advising last summer and advising this summer on the winter. So there's literally a quote from a civil servant to me last year when we were planning for the winter, and I was doing the meeting in July, and she said, we looked out the window and we really stopped paying attention because it was so sunny outside, and Lucy was talking about the winter. And we couldn't believe her. We couldn't contextualize that the winter would be difficult. And this year you move forward. I actually, speaking as myself rather than as the society, I've been exploring the issue of whether we will ever learn again, because I work in disaster recovery. So I see us fail to learn so very often. I see a fire caused by the same building issues here and in Italy. And I wonder whether, next month I'll see one in Pretoria and then in Dubai. How do we learn? Will we learn? And one of the things I think as a commentator on disaster recovery is we are going to think we will learn a lot more about this than we ever will. In order to get to a point where people feel like life is something akin to normal again, one of the things that will happen politically is the squashing of our lessons. And do I therefore think, that there will be a Stephanie and a Lucy in 100 years' time on perhaps an even more innovative form of technology? Maybe we'll be holograms doing this in 100 years, calling for lessons to be learned. I'm afraid, yes, I do, because one of the things as a disaster recoverer is I go back hundreds of years and I'll look at things where, the Great Fire of London, people are calling that this must never be allowed to happen again. And these are the lessons that must be learned. So I think there has to be a pragmatism about the balance between forgetting and going back. And one thing I'd really like to pick up, if I may, on this point about community is that's where I'm the wild card. That's where I would challenge. So I'm sitting in a lot of government meetings now where they're saying, how can we make the community more engaged? How can we do all of this? I have been involved as an activist in disaster management before. So I have been involved in disaster communities affected by disaster. But generally, like all of us on this Zoom today, we're sat here as commentators or as recoverers. It's unusual to also be the affected. And one of the things that I find people, saying to Duncan, perhaps, I haven't tried it yet, so I don't know if he's uncomfortable, but saying, Duncan, how do you feel as a survivor of the COVID-19 pandemic? And we sort of go, it hasn't been that bad. And, I've still been able to work and all of these kind of things. So changing this alienation of who the community is in the pandemic to how do we want a meaningful recovery is the first act of the wild card, and to stop the othering really of the idea of the community. What are we capable of? If we were told now by our local government that we are expected to donate maybe 3 nights a week to looking after older people in our community, have we got that time? And so one of the things that the wild card in recovery is doing a lot back into local government is asking whether it's abusive or right to assume this shift onto community load. That is not the same as saying a community needs to be engaged. But when you are operating in a political society that is looking to outsource its work to other people. So one of the things that, I'll try on the social media is challenge something, and you know what you're going to get back. We are heavily reliant on the UK at the moment on volunteers to deliver most of our health aspects. And we've shifted from volunteers providing all of the infrastructure for our COVID vaccine to now asking them to deliver things like car park management and managing signs and helping people with a cup of tea for our flu vaccine. At what point do we say this transfer of labour is wrong? We are a very well-resourced health system. Many of our managers are on 6-figure sums in the National Health Service. Is this a correct use of community goodwill? Is it misselling the idea of community engagement? So that's why I get shown out of a lot of meetings a lot. Is of community engagement. I'll stop there.
Well, I hope that Jean-Paul's not going to throw you out, but I see his hands up. Jean-Paul, please.
Yes, just some words about community resilience to be connected to Lucy. My day-to-day business is to work with industrial hazards and Wi-Fi, and we don't achieve to teach the people the good knowledge, safe knowledge. When you have a smoke from a factory, you don't go in the school to take your children. And when you are in a forest, you have to clear up around your house. It's very, very difficult. We work all the day on it. And now what we witness in this pandemic crisis, that in France now we have 67 million epidemiologists.
Yes.
Everybody has its own opinion on that. So it means something. Maybe it's a lesson learned also.
Absolutely. I think in the UK we have 65 million experts and 65 million people who are thoroughly bored by it as well. And they just want it to stop. I think the talk about community is one that completely fascinates me, because I think that is going to be one of the huge legacies that COVID has brought us, that is a positive legacy. Recognizing that our communities are even more important and that they are willing to step up, as Lucy said, and step up on a continuing basis. Stephanie, Nathan, in your contexts, communities, I know in Mexico they've been standing up all over. What sorts of lessons do you think that brings for recovery, and how do we continue that in the way that Lucy has mentioned? How do we continue that work? Stephanie, please.
I was wondering, yeah, okay, so I was waiting for Nathan. So I think that one of the topics that was constantly mentioned from Nathan Jean-Paul was the co-responsibility in general terms, and how we make access to this information that is being provided by the federal and the local government. And for the participation of different communities, this has to be an important role to enhance what can be understand, to really we have to decrease our expectations on what we want from the public sector to be understood and to meet the needs of what the people considers to be as an urgent matter. Something that has been an initiative that was started to play the secretariat was these risk prevention committees. But with the pandemic, one of the lessons learned was that there were other type of perhaps non-formal type of organization that also work to attend specific needs or to canalize what the people were considering as an urgent matter. Something that we have to comprehend is that there are different types of organization. Not everything has to be created from scratch or as a new program. We have to, and this is something that we are constantly working on how to better engage, to activate this type of dialogues on this can be your social network of care. Can this network be in charge of your care, of caring about you and your family? This is something that is somehow assume that someone will adapt you and someone will host you and your family, but we don't have this type of conversations that make us interact within each other and talk as a community level with our own neighbors on how do we solve this as a common problem. So I think that this is something that we need to understand. We need to open ourselves more. Not everything has to be bureaucratized. We are now working on a registration for partners on resilience, and it's not about working and saying open spaces for the same people that we have been working, but just going into territory with these non-formal workers and other sectors that and Nathan actually said, right, the heroes of the pandemic, so the janitors, and this is something that we have to continue on the spotlight.
Yeah, great points. And one of the phrases that we've been using in the UK that Nathan used was whole of society, and interpreting that means volunteers, as you said, public sector, and businesses, as Nathan's already talked about. Nathan, you've talked passionately about the role of the private sector, in this. I wonder if there's more that you'd like to say around that interface between public sector, local government, and communities, and that ecosystem around recovery.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Duncan. And yeah, I certainly have. I believe this is where the discussion really needs to evolve much more broadly than it has in the past. And it's one of the things I'm hopeful for coming out of this long-term crisis as we continue to reflect on it. Is our ability to galvanize more of the community that's impacted by this situation. And we've got to get over this, the government-centric sort of approach, and realize that the solutions, frankly, are often within communities. They're within industry sectors. Just the things that we rely on day to day, we've got to bring them into the fold as far as planning, preparedness, mitigation, et cetera. So we've got to broaden this discussion. We've I think done a pretty good job, continue to do a pretty good job between civilian and military authorities. We've got to move from civ mil to civ mil commercial citizen. This has got to be more in the mainstay of our dialogue at really at all levels, but including among nations. I think this is where we get into, what is the role of government, for example, as it relates to citizen preparedness. And as we've seen, again, another critical lesson out of this experience is that citizens are an integral part, they're a critical part of the response, right? They are mitigating this by, we say mask up and social distance, these common messaging, the common messaging we've been promoting, they're a part of the response. I think this really accents what I know in the US and elsewhere, we've been pushing this message of, citizen responsibility here, citizen resilience. You have a role as a citizen for your own safety and those in your family, those immediately around you, neighbors and helping neighbors, that kind of thing. So it's if this has to amplify and drive home really this message that of citizen responsibility, the citizen angle on the overall, frankly, national response, because given our layered approach, we've got to be mindful of that as we go forward here. I think there's a lot we can learn from, again, the international community. I know a lot of the Nordic nations, for example, they're being very honest with their communities, with their citizens, about the realities of a crisis, the realities that government's not going to be there right away. You've got to maintain and sustain your own sort of life and safety priorities without government intervention. And I know they're passing out brochures. The Swedish model comes to mind, but others, very honest with their citizens about what disaster looks like, what crisis means, should it come to that, given again the increasing complexity and severity of the threats and hazards we face. And so this applies to the education community. We've got to get more involved with K through 12. We've got to work on the culture of preparedness here in this country and many others. And remember, that as a friend reminded me recently, culture eats strategy. Okay, so we've got to be mindful that if we harness the power of our national culture for a lot of different things, we should harness it for the power of resilience, because resilience, end of the day, I believe, is a national power, and it comes down to citizens of a nation. And of course, as a more global, interconnected society, we've got to be mindful that this has bearing on our ability to maintain as a nation, our ability to maintain our national essential functions. Those functions we must maintain under all conditions and preserve the way that we go about our way of lives, the way that we organize and govern our societies. And so I'm hopeful we can reflect on this experience, the role of the citizen, the role of industry, role of government, evaluate legislation, ensure we have the necessary tools and resources to move ahead, and recognize what does it mean to make a nation resilient, and recognize that things like our democratic process and values, things like our national institutions are so critical to that way of life and to the functioning of a resilient nation. So just some added thoughts there, Duncan. I kind of expanded upon the citizen piece there, but the connectedness must be maintained as the focus here as we work collaboratively as possible. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And just before I bring in Harold, I think exactly what you've said, Nathan, lies at the heart of a new initiative that we've been beginning in the UK called the National Consortium for Societal Resilience, bringing together all those actors that you've just mentioned from the 4 nations within the UK to talk about whole of society resilience and start to change the way in which that's done in our countries. Harold, I see.
Thank you. Thank you, Duncan. It was just Nathan actually triggered me because he mentioned the Nordic countries. And we have been doing very well, but different between the 4 countries. And one thing which is very, very right about the Nordic countries is a high trust in government. And this high trust is nothing that you can expect when a crisis attack if you haven't built it in the past. And this is something you have to think about. How do you build trust? You do that in peacetime. And you mentioned being honest. Yes, we listen to the government. If they say using masks, we use masks. And another thing is the COVID was never politicized in Norway. Like everybody agreed about how they handled it. There was no discussion between the political parties. And this also ended up with an irony because we just had an election. And the governing political party, they lost because they did very well during the pandemic, but they got no gain of that in the discussion after the pandemic. It's not over, but we are coming very well through. There is a high vaccination rate. I just saw we are up to 75% being vaccinated. 65% have got both vaccines, and we expect about 95% vaccine for the whole country. So these things probably are political issues, and you don't solve them by, changing the system slowly, but building trust is the one important thing. You see differences, though, between the Nordic countries. Norway, Denmark, and Finland have very few deaths, while there are more deaths in Sweden. And maybe that's due to the governance of the system. You have different ways. Who take the decisions? Who do you listen to? And in Norway, there's no discussion with CDC, with the health directorate, and with the government about how did we do. And we see that there was a lot of discussion behind the scene, but the government took a decision they thought was politically right, and it turned out quite well. I think I stopped there.
So I'd just like to close as well by thanking all of our speakers. I think if there are three terms that have come screamingly through in all of the talks, it's about politics or non-politics, it's about whole society and trust. And it's about, obviously there are many, many more issues, but those three seem to have really come out from all of the speakers. And I'd just like to thank Stephanie, Nathan, Lucy, Jean-Paul. Apologise to Jean-Paul for losing you ever so briefly during your talk, but thank you for persevering with us. I'd like to thank Harold and Kyle for organising this today. And I'll just hand back over to Kyle because I'm sure there are some wrap-up things, but just 5 minutes over. So given the scale of what we were talking about today, just thank all the speakers once again.
Thanks, Duncan. Yes, thanks everybody for attending the webinar today. It's a very interesting discussion and completely agree with your kind of wrap-up findings there, Duncan. Certainly there is a lot more to unpack in this, and I'm sure we'll be discussing it for years. So there's been a few questions that we've had in terms of the Q&A as we get through the final administrative piece. I will be sending those questions over to Duncan so he can have them as well, and they'll be able to get those answered through Manchester Briefing or whatever the case is that they're going to do to publish those. If you're joining us from the TIEMS side and you're not part of the Manchester Briefing, go ahead and go over to it's very easy. Just go Google it and type in Manchester Briefing. Go find it. It's a great newsletter that comes out, and you'll be able to see the good work that they're doing over there. And likewise, if you're with the University of Manchester or others and you want to take a look at the TIEMS, the International Emergency Management Society, take a look at TIEMS.info, TIEMS.info, and there's an annual conference coming up in December to take a look at as well. So thank you very much, everybody. And we did go a bit long, but it was a very long, it's a very deep discussion, a lot of issues to come up. And once again, thanks to our panelists for joining us. And apologies for our sort of technical troubleshooting as we were going live here, but very, very much appreciate all of your efforts and your time and contributions to today's discussion. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day and have a great weekend. See you.